Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Finally, today we will discuss the Madhab, the school of Ahlul Dhahir. The main early figure of this school being Dawud al-Dhahiri. His full name being Dawud ibn Ali ibn Khalaf al-Dhahiri. Now one can say that Dawud al-Dhahiri was from the school of Ahlul Hadith, even though it is considered that he went his own way on some issues, specifically the issue of Qiyas, analogy. Now, once again, Imam al-Shafi'i comes into play, as he was from the school of Ahlul Hadith, as we previously mentioned. And then Imam al-Shafi'i, had a student called Abu Thawr. And Abu Thawr was the Shaykh of Dawud al-Dhahiri. So we can trace the Dhahiri Madhab back to Ahlul Hadith, who they themselves can be traced back to the Sahaba, through Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah. And though Imam Dawud has his roots in Ahlul Hadith, his madhab distinguished itself in its own right. And Ahlul Dhahir means the people of the Dhahir meaning the apparent manifestation of the text, the apparent meaning of the text, the obvious literal meaning of the text. So some consider them to be the literalists of Al-Islam. Now many people in the West attach negativity to the idea of literalism, probably based on the literalists in the Christian religion. But as far as Islamic legal issues are concerned, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Being a literalist or looking at the clear and obvious manifestation of the text in many instances, in many cases, and in many masail, meaning legal issues, this can bring out the best of opinions. Now, what's so interesting about this specific madhab is that it was strong in the beginning, and then it eventually declined until it was brought back by Ibn Hazm in the Caliphate of Cordoba. So when the Muslims ruled Al-Andalus, which is modern-day Spain, Ibn Hazm revived this madhab pretty much single-handedly and became the leading figure and central figure of this madhab. Now some do not consider this to be a madhab at all. Some consider it to be like a fifth madhab. Some point to the fact that it does not really exist anymore. Now, in reality, the madhab of Ahlul Dhahir does exist today, but it's not known for being the madhab of a certain country or a specific large group. Rather, many individuals claim to follow it, and this is how the madhab lives on. So many individuals today in the world consider themselves to be Dhahiri. Now, something important to note in order to understand the Dhahiri school is that they are very anti-taqlid, meaning they are against blind following. This means that a later scholar from the Dhahiri school can come and have different opinions from the earlier scholars, or even a different opinion from that of Imam Dawud al-Dhahiri, and that would be completely acceptable in their madhab, and not only that, but it would be considered as a Dhahiri opinion. Now, even though you can see this in other schools, as not every scholar follows their Imam and everything, this is definitely much more present in the Dhahiri school. So it creates this kind of dynamic where, what is the Dhahiri opinion? Now, in many cases, Imam Dawud and Ibn Hazm, they have the same opinion, but when there's a difference, people tend to look at Ibn Hazm because he has done so much work in fiqh that has been preserved, and many of the opinions of Dawud have been lost. And Ibn Hazm has a fiqh book that we can go back to, which is called Al-Muhalla, which is a great book, and it's basically a book of Dhahiri fiqh. So in conclusion, whatever a Dhahiri scholar says and believes to be the truth can be considered to be the Dhahiri opinion, and Allah knows best. Now it's obvious what makes this madhab special, the fact that they look at the apparent and literal meaning of the text, which many times can be a good thing, and at other times that's not the case. However, the Dhahiri madhab was known for rejecting qiyas, analogy. So in the science of Usul al-Fiqh, the chapter on Qiyas is considered to be the most difficult chapter. But to make a long story short, it's basically using an established ruling to issue a new ruling based on the legal reasoning. So an example that's easy for people to understand is the example of drugs. So drugs in Islam are haram. But somebody could say to you, where's the hadith on cocaine? Or where's the ayah on marijuana and LSD? One of the answers to that is qiyas. Because it's established that alcohol is haram, And the reason for that is because it's an intoxicant. Hence, based on this, any other intoxicant can also be pronounced as haram. And this research paper here on the screen portrays how drugs are haram based on qiyas. But this is just an example, just for people to understand what we're talking about. And Ibn Hazm does consider drugs to be haram, but he simply quotes the hadith, "Kullu muskirin khamar," which means every intoxicant is an alcohol. And the Dhahiri would just call this, following the hadith, they wouldn't call this qiyas. But in other cases where there is no specific text, the Dhahiriya, they have their ways and their methods of dealing with not using qiyas. So here in Al-Faqih wal-Mutafaqih by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, just like many other books of fiqh and usul, he shows how the Dhahiriya, they disagreed with using qiyas as a principle in Islamic law. So he shows how they use many of the statements of the Salaf to back up their opinion. But in reality, we can also find recorded instances of the Salaf, the Sahaba, actually doing qiyas. So the way scholars have reconciled this is by differentiating between a praiseworthy qiyas, which is in line with the Quran and the Sunnah, and a shunned qiyas, which is not in line with the Quran and the Sunnah, and goes too far in reasoning and logic. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the Dhahiri scholars are completely against the idea of blind following their earlier Imams. And this is important to keep in mind, as there has been some discussion on whether Ibn Hazm and Imam Dawud al-Dhahiri have the same exact view on qiyas. And there are some earlier scholars who claim that Dawud al-Dhahiri actually agreed with a certain type of qiyas, which is al-qiyas al-jali. So here in Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya by al-Subki, in the biography of Dawud, we can see how certain scholars claim that he believed in al-qiyas al-jali, and that rather it was Ibn Hazm who was against all types of qiyas. And al-qiyas al-jali is basically the clear and obvious qiyas that is heavily in line with the Quran, the Sunnah, and the consensus of the scholars. A good example of which is what we said earlier regarding drugs and alcohol, etc. So it is definitely interesting to note that there is a strong claim that Imam Dawud al-Dhahiri believed in al-Qiyas al-Jali, even though others disagree and believe that he had the same opinion as Ibn Hazm, and Allah knows best. But definitely very interesting. That being said, I hope you have benefited from this presentation. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.